Hello, everyone. This is Elisa Baum. I'm GridGain Systems Senior Director of Product Marketing. We'll begin in just a moment, but first I'd like to conduct a bit of housekeeping. First, could you please raise your hand using the hand icon located in the GoToWebinar control panel to let me know that you can hear me okay. And let me see. So if you hear me, please raise your hand. Okay, I see hands. Thank you for that. Next, during this webinar, you will be on mute, but should you have any questions during the discussion, please enter them in the questions field within the control panel. At the end of the webinar, we'll take time to answer as many questions as possible. And in addition, a recording of this webinar will be made available to everyone within 48 hours. So with that said, I'd like to thank everyone for attending today's session, GridGain Cloud, Deploy Apache Ignite in Minutes. We'll be kicking off with Rob Meyer, who is our head of outbound product management, and then he'll turn the floor over to Akmal Chaudhry, who is GridGain Systems technical evangelist. So with that said, I will turn the floor over to Rob.
All right, hopefully everybody can hear me. I'm Rob Meyer. You will recognize me as the person with the American accent. I will not sound nearly as good as Akmal. What we wanted to do now that GridGain Cloud it started in beta around a year ago, and we've more recently released some other features, particularly persistence. We wanted to go through and just explain a little bit about what it is, the intention behind it, and then walk you through it, because the challenge for Akmal has always been to show people how to deploy Ignite in minutes and how to monitor and manage it as a service. So with that, I just wanted to summarize briefly in case you're not aware of what it is. You can go on to gridgain.cloud or cloud.gridgain.com. It'll all redirect and start a free trial of a free 4-cluster trial and use it for a while. It is a fully managed in-memory computing service. It's built on Apache Ignite. It basically delivers in-memory computing as a cache or as a standalone in-memory database as a service. So as you go through it and as you hear Akmal talk about it and go through it in detail, I think the key things to note is unlike installing Ignite on-prem, it's literally up and running in minutes with as few as 3 or 4 clicks. It is the way you access it is you bring it up as a cluster. You can access it using dynamic SQL or straight SQL. But once you bring it up, it is literally up and running and fully managed as a service. What's a little bit newer in this release is beyond just the in-memory speed on top of a horizontal clustering. You can go as big as you want and as many nodes as you want. What we've added is persistence, which really gives you 2 things. First, when you start and stop the cluster, the persistence keeps the data that you have in the background. When you start back up, it's immediate availability on restart. Instead of having to wait for everything to load, as you're requesting data, you can immediately fetch it from disk, and then over time, as the memory warms up, you're going to be fetching from RAM. So the second is, because the persistence is there, you have the ability to use it as a non-volatile in-memory database. So what Akmal is going to go through, hopefully, if I got this right, Akmal, it's going to show you a little bit of how you can interactively enter in and play with SQL through the web console. But there's also standard Ignite access via JDBC or ODBC, via a REST API, whether using SQL or key value or using any of the thin clients. It's all the standard Ignite that you're used to. It is not, however, full-blown GridGain. I just wanted to make that point just to explain the difference. When you're installing GridGain on-premise, you're getting everything. You can use it as an in-memory data grid that you slide in between your database and your app. You can use it as a in-memory database, obviously. You can also perform streaming analytics or continuous learning. In the case of GridGain Cloud, for now, we've limited it to what is better suited as a standalone service, whether that is a cache that you use for storing data in memory as a service, just a cache aside pattern, or whether it's a full-blown in-memory database. It's something that's going to stand alone that you can access remotely. It's not typically something you're going to slide in between an on-premise database and an on-premise application, just to be clear. But otherwise, it is the core Ignite that you're used to, running as a service on the side of your other infrastructure. So with that, I wanted to again throw out the Mission Impossible challenge for Akmal on how to get this up and running in minutes. Akmal? And Akmal, let me know if you need me to change the presenter, but I think you should be able to do it.
Yes, Rob, if you could do that, please, that would be great. I'm all set.
I will do that while you get up and running.
Yeah, great.
Is your machine decent? Is your machine decent? Can I do it now?
Yes, please go ahead. Yes, I'm
all right.
Thank you. Great. There we go. So hopefully you'll be looking at my desktop now.
I can see it.
Fabulous. Thank you very much. Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Elisa. All right. Well, thank you very much to everyone for joining today. So wherever you are in the world, good morning, good afternoon, good evening. So I'm here in London, and it's a little bit past 7 p.m. here. As Rob mentioned, so we'll cover a little bit on some of the capabilities of GridGain Cloud, and we'll point you to some resources as well that we recently published. Just to kind of get started then, so very simple sign-up process, which I won't show you. I mean, it really doesn't warrant to be covered, but it's a simple sign-up process, just user ID and password. You'll get a confirmation email from GridGain. And then once you've logged in, essentially this is the interface that you'll see. And as you can see, I've got no clusters running here. So very helpfully, it gives me the option to either launch a free cluster or a paid cluster. And there is a little bit of a difference between the two. Obviously, for a paid cluster, there's additional capabilities and resources that you can utilize. For the free cluster, a lot of the presets, the things are fixed. You don't have much configuration options. So if we have a look at this very briefly here, as you can see, a couple of things here. As you can see, Amazon is currently the provider, and we do have some choices in terms of regions. So wherever you are in the world, whether it's United States or in Europe or Asia Pacific, you can choose something a little bit closer. And the instance again is fixed there as well, so you get something reasonably meaty and usable, but obviously with the paid cluster option, it's going to be far more choice available. Now, Rob mentioned the persistence just a few moments ago, and let me see if I can just zoom in a little bit here. Hopefully you'll be able to see that. So as you can see, by default, certainly in the free option here, the enable persistence is already checked for you. As you can see, it's preventing me from changing that. So that's enabled for you, which is, again, helpful just to try things out. And again, you can see some of these other options, again, are ghosted out. So free cluster, yep, great way to get started, get some hands-on experience, use it, learn a little bit about how to utilize it and look at some of the interfaces, which we'll do today. But really, I think if you want to do something more substantial, perhaps you're working on something larger and this sort of enterprise type applications, you need to go for the paid cluster option. Now here I'm going to switch to that one, but we can configure it manually. Here we go. So as you can see here, similar sort of screen, but far more in terms of the boxes. We can change the values. We have a lot more choices in terms of the instances that we can choose from. And again, in terms of how much disk space we need, various other things that we want to run, and I think that's going to be far more useful. Now, again, you'll notice here that there's going to be, obviously for paid cluster, requires some payment information. And so here, cardholder name, credit card details, and this will give you some sense in terms of if we look at the total price per hour by looking at this default configuration here, for example, that's quite high, so $25. But as said before, we can configure this, and as you configure it, as you can see, the price sort of changes here. Okay, so it gives us an idea of what we're going to get for the resources that we want to make use of. Okay, so for this one then, now I've got several accounts sort of set up in this environment just to make it easy for myself to be able to launch things. So I'll minimize this, and let's just have a look here. Okay, so we seem to be okay. There we go. And let's switch over to this. Okay. So here, what I've done is I've actually got a free cluster up and running. And as you can see, the uptime is a sort of couple of hours, just over 2 hours here. It's in the running state. And by default, we have the persistence here. Okay, well, there's not a lot in terms of configuration that we can do. In terms of actions, though, we can do a couple of useful things. So I can stop this cluster, and one of the useful things about that is that the state is preserved. Okay, so it's not just kind of running in memory. So if I decide to stop it, if there's any data that I've stored in this cluster, because by default persistence is checked, I can't uncheck it, then the state is saved, which is great. If I terminate it, then of course that's a different thing. I lose everything. My cluster's gone. But stopping it is kind of helpful, and I'll point you to a couple of resources very shortly, which will kind of walk through this and tell you a little bit more in terms of what we can do and why this is helpful. Once we're sort of up and running, we have this cluster launched. Again, as you can see on the right-hand side, very helpfully, there's a couple of quick demo, command line demo. These demos are built into the system. They're really to get you up and running as quickly as possible. And to give you an opportunity to get some hands-on experience. So for the quick demo, this is built into the kind of web environment. Everything is done for you. For the command line environment, it's slightly different, okay? And we'll look at both of these now to give you some sense of what this is going to look like. So very simple steps in terms of the quick demo. We just have two options. Okay, let me just zoom in there. As you can see, so we can preload some data, and again, I'll show you what the data look like. And again, don't be afraid to run some queries, modify the data, destroy it if you like. It's fine. Okay, you can restore the state back to the initial state anytime by just coming back here and just loading the data in again. It will overwrite what was already there. I mean, that's a great way to get back to a known state. Very helpful. And again, similarly, in terms of queries, this is again great because you get a web-based notebook. You can try there's some pre-built SQL queries that you can run immediately. Fairly complex. Again, we'll look at those in just a moment. And it doesn't require any download or any install on your local machine. Okay, so let's just go back here. Now, I've already done the preload, so let me just click on this one to launch the notebook. Okay, so if you're familiar with the web-based console that you use with Apache Ignite, and this just look very familiar. So it's really same sort of style, same sort of format. So we can create some queries, and as you can see, if we sort of scroll down here a little bit, we've got the opportunity to run some SQL queries directly from here. Okay, now I'll show you the schema in just a little moment, but essentially we've got some information about countries, cities, and sort of populations, and we can run some queries to do some analysis. For example, find the top 3 most populous cities across, say, a number of different countries. Okay, and then that's one of the examples that we have here. And if you look carefully at the syntax there, I mean, this is standard SQL. Okay, so it's SQL 99 support, which it comes and it's something that they worked on for a while. So historically, there was already some level of SQL support within Apache Ignite and GridGain, but really last year and the year before, there was sort of significant effort to get it up to a certain level. And so the SQL 99 support, if you're familiar with that and work with that a lot, then this should be really very familiar to you. So again, We can modify the queries here, we can run them, execute them, and immediately we can get some feedback here. So here, for example, it's a fairly simple query in terms of looking at countries and limiting it to the top 3 results. So the data may be a little bit out of date, but it again gives you a sense in terms of what we can run immediately. Okay. Most inhabited cities. Now here we've got something a little bit more complex. So if you look at this query in a bit more detail, let me zoom in a little bit for you. So here again, you can see we're doing join, and then we're doing group by and order by. So it's somewhat more complex than the previous query. And again, if we execute this, okay, we get some results back here. Oops, sorry. I think it's my fault there. Let me position this cursor there. There we go, and run this again. There we are. Okay, so China, Russian Federation, the United States. So we're limiting our results to 3 countries and then looking at the most popular cities across these: Shanghai, Moscow, and New York in this particular case. All right, let's scroll down a little bit further. And again, simple select. Here, there we go. And if we have a look at the results here, so I think this is country code UZB is Uzbekistan, okay, and this particular city, 237,000. Now, the thing is, of course, these are just retrieving information from what we've already uploaded into the cluster. How about if we want to do make some modifications and changes and change the values? So we can do that again, standard SQL here. So here we're simply taking the particular city code, which we retrieved here previously, which was 3507, and we're setting the population to 1500 this time. So if we execute this, it will give us just a 1 here as a mark of success. And actually, if we go back and rerun the previous query, we should be able to see the population change here from this value to the new value. And let's do that. There we go. And that's exactly what's happened. Okay, so now we're actually making some modifications. Probably a lot more useful than doing simple sort of retrieves. And then the final thing here, of course, is we can actually delete particular rows within the data. Again, we're choosing this particular city, and we're just simply going to run a delete operation. And if we execute this, again, it returns a 1 at the bottom here to show that the operation has been successful. And if we try and run a query now on this, it should give us an error because it cannot find this entry anymore. Okay, so if we just do that. Okay, so there we go. So it says result set is empty. So it couldn't actually, it executed the query but couldn't return back anything for us because that city has now been deleted from our database. Okay, so you have the opportunity, again, to experiment with this. There are options at the top here, add query, for example, and you can add additional sections within here, formulate additional SQL queries to do some analytics, to look at the values, modify them as you want to do them. And again, don't be afraid, if it's a destructive operation, no problem. You can go back to the cluster, reload the data again, and that will return you back to a known state, okay? So this was all built into the environment, which again is helpful because it means you don't have to download or install anything. I mean, you're running entirely within the web-based environment. You've got a cluster running in the cloud, and you can just experiment and try things out, run some SQL queries. That's very, very useful. How about the case then if you want to do something a little bit more different? Say you want to actually run things from a client. Maybe you want to run things from your particular laptop. Or a different sort of machine, be able to connect to the cloud environment, be able to execute queries, perhaps upload data as well. Although probably you want to limit the amount of data that you want to upload because again, it's going to have to cross the network to get to your cloud environment. That's fine too. Okay, so the command line demo again gives you the ability to do this very easily. A little bit more complex here in terms of setup. Okay, so a few more steps to think about because you have to do a few more things. So the first thing that you're helpfully offered is the opportunity to download this GridGain Cloud Client Pack. Okay, so I've done that, and I'll show you that in just a moment. So it's just a zip file. contains it, it's self-contained. Just unpack it, and you've got everything you need locally to be able to get to this cluster. Because we're going to use a secure socket layer to kind of protect our data, there is a Java key store which is automatically generated for you. And again, there's a link to be able to download this, and we these web-based demos. And then for the connection, then as part of the GridGain, this client pack, which we previously downloaded in step one of the things that we get with this is this Sql Line Tool. Very nice kind of lightweight tool, allows you to run things on a kind of terminal command shell. It's not very heavy, okay, but it's a great way to, again, perform operations, connect to the cluster, run things locally. And again, you can see here that this connection string is auto-generated for you. So we're using this thin client, JDBC. Rob mentioned this in his slide, okay, is one of the ways that we can access this. So we've already looked at some sort of SQL, which we can formulate. Now we're going to do a connection through JDBC. And again, you can see this string is kind of auto-generated for you. It's all the information you need. We simply need to copy it, which we can do from here, copy to clipboard, which is sufficient for our needs. So let me do that, okay? So I've got this available to me, and I'll show you the rest in a moment. And again, what we have is the opportunity to preload the database. We can do this directly from the command line environment, and I'll show you that in just a moment as well. Okay, let me zoom out, and then finally at the bottom then, we can run an example sort of query. So if we look at this, this is again a simple sort of select statement, similar to what we were running just a few moments ago in the web environment, but this is running it directly from the Sql Line Tool. So now, excuse me, those queries, we have a client which connects to our cloud environment, and then from that SQL Line Tool, we can, initiate queries, we can do data loading, there's a whole range of things, all SQL-based operations can be done from there. And the other thing is that, keep in mind, I mean, this is just a lightweight tool that's provided as part of this distribution. However, there's nothing to stop you using another client if you wish to do so. I mean, all the connection information is provided for you. You just need to plug this into your favorite tool, and you'll be able to do exactly the same thing from there as well. Okay, so this is, again, to give you an opportunity to try something out, but keep everything reasonably lightweight and easy to use. All right, so let's minimize this. Okay, and let me just minimize this a moment, and then we can switch to a couple of things on the terminal here and show you this. All right, so first thing to do is that what I've done previously is I've downloaded the GridGain Cloud Client Pack. As you can see, I've unzipped it, and the contents are very straightforward. So we've got some examples here. There's a bin directory for some commands that we can run. I think it's .shell and .bat. It will run in Windows as well. There's libraries and so on. ODBC is as well, which we're not going to see today, but Rob mentioned this in his presentation. Okay, so if we drill down, now recall that we're using SSL, so we've got this keystore.jks, which I've downloaded and put into this bin directory. Okay. And as part of this, we've got for Windows SQLine.bat, and then for Linux and Mac environments SQLine.shell. So we will have a look at that in just a moment. Okay, so let me just minimize this a little bit. Okay, so now a couple of terminal windows open here, and I said I would show you the schema. So I've talked about this kind of database system that comes as part of the distribution, whether you're going to use it online or if you're going to run it from the command line environment locally. We can have a look at this. And I'll show you the SQL command. Okay, so you may be familiar with this already. Okay, so this is something that is sort of fairly widely used. So we've got a couple of tables here. There's a country table, as you can see. Lots of different types: varchar, decimal, small int, integer, and so on. And so all of this is just standard SQL 99. Now, notice that we've got a little bit of sort of an extension here. This is to provide some hints to our GridGain cluster in terms of how it stores that information. You know, do we want some backups? Yes, we do. Here we've specified, yes, we'd like one backup copy. And so there are other things that we can do as well. You know, co-location, for example. So if we've got certain types of data, maybe we want to be able to store that data together. So think about countries and cities, for example, or maybe an auto manufacturer and the actual cars, the vehicles that they manufacture, or cities and the sort of the people that live in those cities. There are things that we can do which will allow us to store that data together. And again, for querying, that's very useful because, you know, in distributed environments, what we want to do is to minimize the movement of data as much as possible. You know, bring the processing to the data when we can. Okay, so if we have a look then a little bit further down, so there's another table, city table. Again, we've got a variety of data types there. And again, you can see there's a little bit more information here. Again, we're keeping one backup. Now this thing, affinity key, country code, okay? So now it's using this to be able to do some co-location, okay? And that's very, very useful. And then we've got a third table here as well, country language, okay? And then further down, of course, is just a standard insert statement. So I won't go through all of these, but you can have a look at this in your own time. And it just populates the database for us, okay? It's just, oops, quit from here. There we are. Okay, so let's just minimize this. Okay, get back here and let me just get back to the cloud environment. Now, I think I previously copied to the clipboard. I did, yes, I remember now. There we go. And so what we want to do then, to making sure that I'm in the right directory, which I am, and we can just paste this here. Okay, and let me just zoom in a bit. Okay, so we can see this, and then we just hit that. And there we go. So now we're in. So as you can see, this is currently at version 1.3, but you know, it's a great kind of lightweight tool that we can use. And from here, okay, if we just go back, copy this to the clipboard again, and back here, and we can paste this in. Now, the thing is, if you were sharp-eyed, you will notice that in the schema I just showed you, there are some drop table commands. So essentially, this is doing the same actions that we did when we loaded the data in from the quick demo. So essentially, what it does is that if those tables are already there, it will overwrite. I mean, it will drop the existing values and load the new ones in. And this is exactly what this will do. So it's the same set of tables that we were using in the quick demo. We can run this from here. So it's reasonably fast. You can see it's just running through quickly, loading the data in. And that's pretty much it. There we go. So it didn't take too long. 1.928 seconds. There we go. Now, from this environment, again, what we can do, take an example here. This is a select query. Copy this to the clipboard. Just minimize this back here, and we can paste this in. And just zoom in here. And we can now run these queries. So this is kind of similar to what we were doing previously. Again, looking at population based on city and no particular qualification, just looking at these tables and then just picking the three values from in descending order. So here we've got Mumbai, Seoul, and Sao Paulo. So again, great way to interact with the cloud environment using a very simple kind of shell environment, very lightweight environment, but nothing to stop you using another client if you happen to have a particularly favorite one that you want to do, or the connection information is provided for you. Just plug those values in and you'll be able to do that directly. All right, so let's have a look now. A couple of other things then. So Rob talked about JDBC support and SQL, which we've kind of covered. Okay, so we've seen how to use the thin client. Using the Sql Line Tool, we've been able to run some SQL directly from the notebook. That's fine too. Another way to interact with our cloud environment. I've mentioned already to you that there's some actions that we can take. So now, if we have a look at our cluster environment, I think I've got the monitoring window open here. Yep, in a different, and we can scroll down here. Okay, so let's just have a look. So here you can see, hopefully that's reasonably visible to you. Let me just zoom in a little bit and then scroll to the left and right. So here are the 3 tables that we had previously, and as you can see, it gives us some information, the total number of values that are stored for each one. If we scroll across here, and because we specified that we want a backup, notice that it says primary and backup, okay? And then obviously the total is going to be twice what this primary plus backup is. So we're not stressing this cluster particularly at the moment. And we can look at the sort of utilization just a little bit higher up here in terms of cache, latency, heap size, and so on. Okay, there's lots of useful information here that will help you, I think, once you start to deploy this in a production environment. That will be very, very helpful to you. So fairly small databases, but for now, that's okay. I mean, just for demo purposes, for illustrative purposes, these are absolutely fine. All right, so now let's have a look at some other ways that we can interface with this. Now, recall that Apache Ignite and GridGain, they are multi-model systems. So historically, if we look at Ignite and GridGain, then the way that we used to interact with this, some years back, was key value. I mean, that's where this technology came from. The ideas came from as a key value store, and the SQL capabilities were added later on. And of course, now we have the opportunity. We can interface with it either directly using key value, using simple sort of put-get operations if we want, or we can work at the level of relational data, relational tables, and run SQL 99 queries. That's absolutely fine too. So there are, I think, different circumstances and different ways that you might want to interface with your system depending upon your needs and your business requirements. But then let's look at some examples of how we can do this. So one of the ways that we can interact with this, so we talked about the thin client, okay, so that was using JDBC from the command line, but there are thin client available for other programming languages as well. So here we've got an example using Java, okay, and I'll show you a little bit on this, and then I've got a Python example for you as well. Note that there's also support for PHP, there's also support for Node, and C++ and .NET, okay, and then this is covered in the documentation, which again, I'll point you to very shortly. So briefly, let me switch back then. So what do we need to do then in order to utilize these thin client environments? Well, here from our cluster information page, I'm just going to click on the cluster name. And here it gives you a lot of helpful information. So if you were kind of wondering where on earth do you get all this JDBC, ODBC, REST, and thin client information from, this is the page, okay? So this gives you everything you need. And you'll notice that, again, here on the left-hand side, let me try and zoom in a little bit here, cluster password, okay? So I'm okay to show this to you, no worries, because you need a bit more information than this to be able to connect to my cluster. So I have no concerns about that. But it generates something for you. You can change this if you want, that's absolutely fine. So typically then for using the thin client, we need some bits of information. Usually it's the username and the password. We need also this, excuse me, thin client address, which we can see here. Let me try and highlight that for you, this one. And also, if we're going to do things like SSL, which we did with the Java key store, this is where I downloaded it from, okay? And then you also have the opportunity, if you want to use, say, a PEM certificate or PFX certificate, you can do that. And then there's also an SSL password here. Again, I'm happy to show this to you. I don't think you do need some, these additional SSL certificates in order to access my cluster right now, so that's fine. Okay, so if we minimize this down, okay, so all the information we need is available here. And let me switch to my Java code then. So what I've done is I've written two very small sort of bits of Java code here. So one of them here, let me try and highlight this for you. There we go. This is actually taking the information from that cluster information page. Okay, so I've plugged in the thin client, as you can see, so that just a few moments ago, the username, the password, the SSL password here, and that's pretty much it. And this is just using a template that's available in our documentation, and I'll show you where to get that, and that's very, very straightforward. The other bit of Java code here is then using this key value interface. Okay, so now what I'm doing is I'm creating a cache called put_get_example. Okay, I'll show you that in just a moment when we run this. And then we're just doing some very simple operations here. We're just writing a couple of values into it using these simple sort of put commands. It's a key value. Okay, so the key is 1, the value is John Doe, the key is 2, the value is Jane Roe. And then we're just printing these values out here. We're doing sort of get operations to actually retrieve these back from our cache. So it's writing them in and then retrieving them straight away. Okay. Now, this is in my IDE environment, but I can run this straight away. Okay, so we can say run data loader. Okay. Okay, so just give that a moment. I think it may need to. There we go. Just make that a little bit bigger, okay, and then just if we scroll in and have a look, and there we go. Okay, so cache put example started, it stored the values in the cache, and then it's retrieved them back for me. Okay, so this is using the key value interface. Now, how do we know the data has actually gone in? Well, again, if we go back and have a look at our monitoring, and if we now scroll down a little bit here, we can see that in addition to the 3 tables that we were looking at previously, there is a new, something new here, put_get_example, okay? And again, if we scroll to the right-hand side and have a look at what's actually going on, we've got 2 primary values, and because it's creating backups for us, 1 backup automatically, then the total number of values is 4, okay? So these have been stored now. 2 key values have been stored into this particular cache for us. Okay, now let's try something else now. Okay, so we've looked at Java, and I'm running that from an IDE. How about if we switch to a different environment, say Linux, and look at a little bit of Python code? So Python, okay, so here code is somewhat more shorter, as you can see. Let me just highlight too, and that's essentially it. That's everything. So I didn't have to create 2 separate programs for this. Actually, I could have done it in the Java as well, but it's kind of nice just to separate the configuration from the actual data loading. So here we just create again our client, the username, the password we picked up from the cluster information page. That's fine. And I've downloaded this client.pem file, okay, which is actually residing in my home directory. And I've been careful to set the permissions on this so that only I could read it. Okay, now in your environment, obviously you will have a particular location where you want to store this. Perhaps there's a kind of repository that you use on your computer. That's fine. Okay, so you make sure that the information is secure, because without this, then we can't connect. The thin client URL, again, you can see we've entered that here. And then again, same kind of format that we did with the Java, which is writing a couple of values in using our key value interface. So in this case, we've got a key of 3 and a key of 4, and we've got the values Mary Major and Richard Miles, respectively. So we're writing these now into the cache. And then again, a couple of lines down, we're just retrieving these values and output to the terminal again, okay, which we can do. So let me minimize this, and again, just run this from here, and the output will look pretty much the same as what the Java code produced. There we go. So there, we've got a couple of new values that we've added, and this is running in a totally different environment, using a totally different operating system and a totally different programming language. And again, how do we know that this has changed? Well, if we go back to our monitoring page and again have a zoom in and look, now notice that we've got 4 primary values stored, okay, which is the 4 key values that we stored, 2 from each of the 2 programs that we were running. And again, it's created backups as well for us. That gives us a total of 8. Okay, so other things that we can do here, so we can clear some of these caches, okay, if we want to, and there's other things, operations that we can do. I'd encourage you, take some time to have a look at this, play around with this environment, try to get some hands-on experience with this, understand what's going on, and again, utilize these resources. There is documentation references, which we have available on the left-hand side. And if I click on that, it will take me to this getting started, which contains somewhat more information that we will be able to cover today, but it talks you through all the steps in terms of signing up, which we didn't show a little bit earlier on. It's very, very straightforward, as I said before. And then many of the things we've already covered in terms of free cluster and paid cluster, and utilizing some of the demo resources, securing the connection, okay, using some of these additional capabilities that we have, such as, if we want to use the SSL, whether we want to use a Java key store or a PEM file, and so on. Those could be very, very important to you. Other things, then, just over the past couple of days, I've written a couple of blog posts. So this is from our homepage on gridgain.com. So if you just drill down, one of the links that we have available along the top is called blog. I think my article at the moment is highlighted at the top, though that may change, of course, but you'll be able to still find it. And so there was a piece, let me just scroll down a little bit here. So getting started with GridGain Cloud, this was published Thursday last week. So this contains a lot of screenshots. So walks from absolutely first principles in terms of how to get to the website, how to create the account, and so on, and creating a cluster, again, distinguishing between free and paid and the choices you have available there. And obviously, because the paid cluster is more configurable, and you can decide, what is appropriate for your budget and your business requirements. A quick walkthrough of the quick demo and the command line demo, which, as you can see, very, very straightforward. Just follow the steps one by one, and you'll be able to get that working. Cluster monitoring, very, very briefly covered there. That's, again, very useful and helpful to see what's going on, what caches are available, how much you're using in terms of resources, and looking for, these type of numbers are always very useful in terms of understanding the behavior of the cluster. Stopping or terminating the cluster. So one of the things that you can do, as I said before, which is helpful, and I've used this over the past couple of days, is just to stop the cluster. And with a free one, that's kind of useful, because you can come back to it a couple of days later and then start the cluster up again, and then continue, playing around, experimenting, doing what you need to do, and have a look at that environment. And the second article, which was just published a couple of days ago, I think it was Sunday. There we go. Same sort of coverage of what we've just done. So we just basically talk a little bit about the Java thin client, okay, the sort of information that we can obtain from the cluster information page, and that we just plug these values into our code. And I'll show you the templates in just a moment. I've taken them literally from the documentation and then just added my particular bits of code there. Now you'll see that these are kind of preloaded with the values that I use. Obviously, you will plug in the values that are appropriate for you. Now, I'm not worried that I'm exposing this information to you. That's fine, because, as I said before, you do need something beyond just this information in order to be able to access my cluster. So that's absolutely okay. And I'll probably destroy those anyway. So the cluster will go. So it's not a problem. So everything we discussed here, again, the Python thin client example, the code that I utilized, all there, and just a screenshot to show you the environment there. So next steps then, so with the documentation that is available, the getting started is obviously a great place to start. How to secure the connection is going to be very, very important to you in terms of authentication, encryption, and so on. And then, as I said before, there's plenty of coverage in terms of utilizing SQL. Rob talked about this, JDBC, ODBC, just using standard SQL from the notebook environment, for example, and also how to use the thin clients, for example. And here, the templates that they provide, which is exactly what I've taken. So they've got Java code here, .NET if you want to use that, the C++, and the newer ones which have really been available recently. So the Python, PHP, Node, and so on. Okay, and we didn't have an opportunity to cover the REST API, but again, if you're interested, there is some information and documentation available to help with that. Okay, so all very straightforward. I think that's okay. So I think lead monitoring. Okay, there we are. I think it's gone back to here. So it's stopped now. There we go. Okay, I think that's pretty much everything I wanted to show. I'm kind of conscious of time, so I think we've got roughly 10 minutes or so for some questions, and very happy to take any questions. Anything that I can't help you with, or my colleagues Rob or Alicia can't help you with, please just drop us an email. So in my case, it's just first name dot last name akmal.chaudhry@gridgain.com. But I think I'll hand it back to Rob and or Alicia, and then if there are any questions, very happy to take those. Thank you very much.
All right. Well, thank you, Akmal. Just a couple questions. The first one is how persistence works. Is it similar to Ignite in that as the node is coming up, that the disk, basically requests are handled via disk until the memory, the RAM warms up, and then it's handled via RAM. How does that work in GridGain?
Yeah, I think there's a fairly detailed information about this, Rob. But if you look here, and unfortunately I've got this particular page open. Here we've got, let me just try and zoom in here. Can you see this? Wow, disk per
yes.
node. Yes, absolutely right. So remember that GridGain is based upon Apache Ignite. And GridGain Cloud, although it doesn't implement all the capabilities of Apache Ignite, as you rightly pointed out a little bit earlier on in your presentation, nevertheless, the mechanism that it uses is identical. That makes sense, okay? Because it's underlying, it uses the same kind of approach in terms of managing persistence, managing logs, the write-ahead log, for example. And so saving the state using these partition files and so on, all of this is helpfully kind of taken care of for you here. I mean, in this case, for this paid cluster, I have a choice. I could enable persistence or not. And if I enable persistence, then it gives me some options here. And if we look on the right-hand side here in terms of reliability, it gives me some options here as well, which are helpfully explained here in the documentation, just to give you some choices in terms of, do you want the fastest method or do you want the slowest method? And where data is synchronized, crashes, power outages, all these things can have an impact, and it depends on what level of risk, I guess, if that's the appropriate word, you're prepared to take, or what is acceptable to you. So yeah, absolutely right. So there is detailed information about how Ignite does this at a low level, which we can certainly find. Off the top of my head, I don't have the URL, the link for it, but yes, this uses the same approach.
Okay, and the second question is this the same web console as the download web console or the hosted web console as a service? So maybe give a little bit of information about those two.
Okay, so yes, there is a web console which I touched upon in my presentation. So if this is something that you've used previously, I tend to use the one that's hosted by GridGain. So I go to console.gridgain.com. I've got an account on that website, and then if I want to have a look at my Ignite cluster, for example, locally, I need to run a web agent on my laptop. That's fine. I mean, the look and feel is similar to the environment that you saw us demonstrate today. You can download that separately and build it locally, or you use it, hosted on GridGain. Obviously, if you're going to run it, it's better to download and build it locally, host it behind your own firewall, and run it internally. You would not, with greatest respect to GridGain, you probably don't want to run the console on GridGain's website if you're looking at your own kind of environment. But yes, the tooling is the same. I mean, the look and feel is the same. The notebooks, the monitoring, all of those capabilities. It doesn't include everything. So if you do a side-by-side comparison between the two, again, going back to that point that you made a little bit early on, that GridGain Cloud is not the same as GridGain or Apache Ignite for that matter. So some of the capabilities you saw today in the web interface, you will notice that, and if you've used the web console before, they are not available. You didn't see them. I didn't utilize them today because it doesn't make sense to use them. So yes, it's the same, again, the same underlying technology, but using the things that kind of make sense within this environment.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, and I think it's possible to actually configure an Ignite or GridGain cluster by connecting to a database from the web console as a service, but it's more of a security issue if you really want to do that, right?
Yes. So there's nothing to stop you. Remember, we use the JDBC thin client. Okay, so that contains there's a sort of password information in there. There's a connectivity information in there. But again, because we're using SSL, we've got a key store file that we can also use, which protects us. So you can, in theory, we didn't show it today, but you can just go ahead and won't be any issue. Connect to an external database system if you want to, and protect it using those capabilities that we saw today. That will ensure that you're using secure connections and no one's going to kind of pry into what's actually going across the wire and what sort of queries you're running. So yeah, that's entirely possible.
Yeah, it's just to your point, most people don't allow tunneling directly to your database through SSL. So you're probably downloading a version of Web Console. And you can just search for download GridGain Web Console. I think that's what you can search for, and you'll find the right download. I think there's an Ignite download as well.
Yes, that's right. So typically what I do, there's a web agent. So if you register on console.gridgain.com, obviously that's something that's hosted by GridGain. But when you first launch it, tries to look for a cluster, and it needs this web agent to run, and you'll have a link to download this web agent, which you need to actually be running as well, in addition to your cluster. So your web agent talks to your cluster, and then the console talks to the web agent, and that's great. But if you want to build it locally, yes, the source is available. I think you can get it through the Apache website. You can download the console source. You can build it locally. You can host it on your own network privately. As I said before, recommended that you do it behind your firewall and don't expose it to the outside world. That's probably the best way to do it. But if you just want to play around with it, again, just get a sense of how to use it, then it's very easy to create a free account on the GridGain web console. Just utilize that again to kind of test it out, try it out, and to see what its capabilities are. That could be a good way forward.
Perfect. Well, Akmal, those are all the questions I see. So thank you so much for doing this in a few more minutes, but with a lot more explanation. So thank you.
All right.